Welcome back to the David Pakman Show. It's Thursday and time for Worldview with Denis Campbell. Denis is editor-in-chief of UK Progressive Magazine. Denis, let's talk about what are Europeans thinking about the potential of a Mitt Romney presidency. Number one, do they think it's likely he would win? And number two, what will the effect be on the perception of the United States, which has increased as a positive thing under President Obama, if Mitt Romney were to be elected?
It's interesting to take a look at that issue because The Guardian, about a week ago, through their subsidiary and relationship with YouGov at the University of Cambridge, did an extensive survey, not just of Europe, but across the Middle East and Africa. They interviewed something like 12,700 people on this issue of Mitt Romney and his favorability or unfavorability. One of the things they found was that here in the UK, there was a very, very high level of dislike towards Mitt Romney, largely based on the fairly recent, at that point in time, trip with all the gaffes around the Olympics, the fact that he insulted people. They could only find one out of every 20 people that felt he would be an asset to the United States. So that meant 19 out of 20 totally disagreed with the choice of him as a potential president. They viewed him very unfavorably. In fact, only 3% said they would make them feel more favorably. And that sentiment was mirrored both in Germany and France. 4% and 5% would make them feel more favorable as well towards the U.S. It's a really, really mixed bag, though, once you get outside, because of the relative unknown who Mitt Romney is at this point. People know a little bit about him from the gaffes, but when you get into the Middle East, he's a little bit less known. Surprisingly, his unfavorables are not as high as they are in the earlier poll here in the United Kingdom and across the rest of Europe. There's also a lot of concern about the job that President Obama has done, quite frankly. A number of Europeans were asked about how well he did on the whole issue of Guantanamo Bay. The drone attacks are having a huge influence on the way people in the Middle East feel about the U.S. administration. So it's not a complete bed of roses for the president either, but their impression of Mitt Romney is one of just absolute horror show.
All right, now American conservatives who watch our show are certainly going to say, we don't care what Europe thinks about our president or about our country. We want the guy that we think will be best here. So putting aside for a second all the reasons why Mitt Romney would not be good for the country, putting that aside for a second, what can we say specifically to those American conservatives who say, we just don't see how Europe's opinion of us makes any difference at all?
Well, I really think the biggest issue is going to be, and this came up in the course of the poll as well, and there's also been a separate poll done in Berlin, that the advisors to Mitt Romney, the roughly 30 advisors that he has on the issue of foreign policy, the vast majority of those, from Dan Senior to John Bolton, are members of the neocon faction that got the U.S. into the wars in both Iraq and Afghanistan. So Europe is painfully aware of what those 8 years of the Bush administration were, particularly the period after September 11th. So I don't think you're going to see a lot of change other than the fact that people really do not like the neocons that he's aligned himself with and the very sharp pro-Israeli rhetoric. That's showing up in all of the polling that we're seeing here, and that's not helping him at all.
Do you think that, I heard something funny from someone, which is all these gaffes that we're talking about with Mitt Romney, particularly during that trip to Europe and Israel, and also here in the U.S., people saying they're not really gaffes. He's just saying what he believes and people don't like it. I'm wondering if maybe we have a semantic problem where maybe I've been calling them gaffes also, but maybe they're not really gaffes. They're just horrifying truths. I don't know. Should we be changing our language here?
Well, I don't know if it's gaffes. I mean, that's an interesting word. I mean, I think what you have is a disconnect in the way in which this man thinks and addresses issues. He's a businessman. And the last businessman president, and I have to leave George W. Bush out of the equation, that the United States had was Herbert Hoover. And this was a man who, after 10 months in office, oversaw the Great Depression.
Right.
So you've got some issues here of the language of business versus the language of governing and diplomacy. And what we've seen both in the recently released tape that's made all the news the last 48 hours in the US, as well as the gaffes that he has made along the way, are an example of someone used to speaking in very clipped, very strategic, very direct language, which is not the language of diplomacy. It's not the language of governing. You need to be able to, campaign in poetry and govern in prose. He's already in prose and probably in a staccato form of prose that's not helping him to actually make people like him. I was listening to the Morning Joe program podcast this morning, and I think that the gentleman from the Huffington Post, Sam Stein, hit the nail on the head. Romney has come up with all the reasons to hate Obama, and they're sounding rather tired. What he's not done is convinced people why they should like him and vote for him. And I think that's the issue we ran into, frankly, in 2004 with John Kerry versus George W. Bush. We all hated George W. Bush, but we didn't fall in love with John Kerry. And I think you're seeing a little bit of that in reverse here. And I don't see how, the way this candidacy has been going and the way this campaign has been going, he's going to be able to pull out of that particular nosedive that he's in at the moment.
All right, we're going to keep an eye on it. We've been speaking with Denis Campbell, editor-in-chief of UK Progressive Magazine, Thursday's Worldview with Denis Campbell segment. Thanks as always, Denis.
Thank you, and I'm going to go have that cup of coffee now.